Welcome back to Under Baobab Skies. Tonight, our journey takes us far north, to a place where the land itself seems to breathe like a sleeping beast. A place of shifting gold and profound silence. We're traveling to the Sahara. This is not merely a desert. It's a living labyrinth of sand and sky, vast enough to hold the ghosts of 1,000 forgotten empires, yet cruel enough to test the very core of every soul who dares to cross its expanse. It's a world painted in extremes, where the sun reigns with an iron fist and the night offers a cold, star-studded embrace. And yet, for centuries, this formidable landscape was the workplace, the home, and the legacy of men known as the Berber guides. They were the lifeblood, the essential veins through which Africa's ancient trade flowed. Imagine caravans, stretching for miles, their camels laden with salt, gold, ivory, and whispered prayers, moving like a slow river through a world that cared little for their survival. For these guides, survival wasn't a matter of luck. It was a science, a discipline passed down through generations. It was a memory etched not just in their minds, but in their bones. It was the sacred art of reading the stars, of understanding the subtle language of the wind, and most importantly, of knowing when the shimmering horizon was telling you a beautiful, deadly lie. They didn't just cross the desert, they communed with it. They understood its rhythms, its dangers, and its fleeting moments of grace. The desert gives nothing freely. It's a relentless teacher. It will test your thirst until your throat feels like sandpaper. It will test your patience as you stare at an unchanging landscape for days on end. And it will test your faith when you feel utterly alone, a tiny speck in an ocean of sand. And if you listen, truly listen, it whispers stories in the wind tales of those who vanished beneath the dunes. Their bones, now part of the sand's eternal, haunting song. Tonight, under the calm, silent breath of starlight, we will walk the path of these Berber guides. We will try to feel the sting of a sandstorm against our skin, the precious weight of water in our flasks, and the profound, humbling silence that exists between the great dunes. We will uncover the secrets of their navigation, the traditions that bound them together, and the quiet resilience that allowed them to thrive where others perished. But more than that, we will see the hidden nobility in their endurance. We will witness the quiet pride of those who carried entire civilizations across a sea of nothingness, connecting worlds, ideas, and cultures. Their story is not just one of survival. It's a testament to human strength, wisdom, and the unbreakable bond between people and the land they call home. It's a story of how to find your way when all seems lost, guided by the wisdom of those who came before. So, find a comfortable spot, settle in and breathe deeply. The night stretches long before us, and the great desert awaits. Let the stories of the sand and the stars fill the space around you. Thank you for joining us. If you enjoy these journeys into the heart of history and legend, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps us continue to bring these stories to light. You are now under Baobab skies, and our story begins now. By the end of this journey, you'll understand what it meant to live and sometimes die in the service of the desert's endless trade. The life of a Berber guide was not one of luxury or legend. It was dust, pain, and devotion. Each dawn began before the sun's first cry. The desert has no mercy for those who linger. Men woke coughing sand, their lips already cracked, their minds heavy with the distance yet to come. Imagine it, a caravan stretching like a weary serpent across the horizon, hundreds of camels, each groaning beneath loads of salt, gold, cloth, and dates. And at the very front, the guides walked. Their faces were wrapped in indigo veils, their eyes scanning for the faintest sign of trouble. Broken hoofprint, a wrong wind, the shimmer of heat that hides a mirage. To the Berbers, the desert was both a teacher and a tyrant. A single mistake could erase a lifer misplaced step, a forgotten landmark, a waterskin left half empty. The sand swallowed all. There were no graves, only dunes shifting to hide yesterday's dead. Many routes ran from the Maghreb to the Sahel, connecting legendary towns like Timbuktu to Gaza, Gadams, and Gao. But to cross them was to risk everything. Sandstorms could rise without warning, walls of gold taller than mountains, screaming through the wind like the voice of an angry god. Men covered their heads and knelt by their camels, praying that the storm would not scatter the group, or, worse, bury them alive. When the wind finally settled, silence returned, vast, heavy, almost holy. The desert after a storm feels like a graveyard holding its breath. Men coughed, spat sand, and counted what remained: the living, the water, the beasts. Water. That was the true gold of the Sahara. Each skin was guarded like a priceless treasure. Sometimes a single drop was shared between 3 men, their tongues trembling for a touch of moisture. To find a well was salvation. To miss one was certain death. And the Berbers, those silent masters of the desert, knew every hidden oasis by heart. Their minds were maps, written not on paper but in memory and myth, passed down through generations. These mental maps were their most sacred inheritance, a secret language that allowed them to read the barren landscape like a book. They didn't just know where the water was, they knew the character of each well, its seasonal reliability, and the spirits rumored to guard it. The Berber guide was never free from danger. It wasn't just the elements they had to fear. Bandits stalked the trade routes, rival tribes, and desperate men driven by hunger. Sometimes entire caravans vanished without a trace, stripped bare of goods and life alike. Other times, betrayal came from within: a jealous merchant, a desperate servant, a man who could no longer endure the sun's relentless glare. Trust was a fragile currency, and the guide had to be as skilled a reader of men as he was of the sand. He watched the faces around the campfire, listened to the whispers, and sensed the undercurrents of fear and ambition that could unravel a caravan from the inside out. Yet through all this, the Berber guide endured. He did not merely walk the desert, he listened to it. He read its moods like scripture. He could taste the wind and know whether a sandstorm was coming by dawn. He could sense when a camel was about to collapse long before it stumbled and fell. And he trusted no compass, only the stars. At night, the desert softened. The oppressive heat gave way to a profound cold, and the sky transformed into a breathtaking canvas of light. Men gathered around small fires, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames, and told stories that blended truth and spirit. They spoke of ancestors who rode the dunes before time began, of jinn that guarded wells, and of travelers turned into stars for their bravery. Each story was both a warning and a prayer that tomorrow the desert might spare them. There was one truth every guide carried deep within his heart. The desert remembers everything. It remembers each footprint, each desperate cry for help swallowed by the wind. It remembers those who took more than they gave, who disrespected its fragile ecosystems. And it remembers those who approached it with humility, who respected its profound silence. This was not a sentimental belief. It was a practical philosophy for survival. The desert taught that consequences were absolute. A lack of respect for its rules, whether about water usage, navigation, or tribal boundaries, would inevitably lead to ruin. The guides were the keepers of this unwritten law, ensuring that the human passage left as small a scar as possible on the ancient landscape. By daylight, the heat returned with a vengeance. The sun was a hammer, pounding down on the endless expanse of sand. Sand burned through leather sandals. Metal buckles seared flesh. The camels groaned and spat, their humps shrinking with thirst as the days wore on. Men spoke less and less, conserving breath, conserving energy. The only sound was often the soft, rhythmic clanging of the bells on the lead camel, a sound like the heartbeat of a dying god, marking their slow, determined progress across the stillness. The Berber guide was more than a navigator in these moments. He was a shepherd of souls. Every decision he made could mean life or death for dozens. To choose the wrong route, to misjudge a well's distance, to linger for too long in the false promise of shadeny of these could condemn the entire caravan. So he learned to think like the desert itself, to move with immense patience, to measure progress not in miles covered, but in days survived. When a man died, as many inevitably did, he was buried quickly and without ceremony. A shallow grave was dug, marked only by a simple pile of stones or a wooden staff planted upright in the sand. The guides would whisper quiet prayers, their faces turned to the west, and then they would move on. The desert did not allow for mourning. It demanded constant motion. To stop was to invite death for the rest of the group. The grief was carried internally, a heavy weight added to the burdens they already bore. This stoicism wasn't born of coldness, but of a deep, pragmatic understanding that survival was a collective effort, and the needs of the living caravan had to take precedence over the solemnity of death. But in the cool of the evening, as the first stars began to whisper across the sky, the men's spirits would lift. Songs would drift through the night, soft, rhythmic, and ancient. They sang of home, of mothers and wives waiting by the coast, of lovers who would never know for sure if their men survived this perilous journey. The Berber tongue, Tamazight, carried both sorrow and pride in its melodies, a sound that felt like sand slipping through your fingers, beautiful and impossible to hold. It was in these moments of shared music and quiet camaraderie that the bonds between the men were forged, creating a temporary family in the heart of the void. And through it all, the desert listened, unmoved, eternal, a silent witness to their fleeting existence. Tomorrow they would rise again, pack their things, and walk toward another mirage, chasing another promise on the horizon. Because that was the way of the guides, to walk into emptiness again and again, knowing that the desert never truly returned those it took. In the merciless heart of the Sahara, the sun was a relentless enemy, but it was not the only one. Every Berber guide who dared to traverse these endless sands knew that the dunes had eyes. Beyond the flickering comfort of the campfire, in the deep, silent valleys between the ridges, other men watched. They were desperate, cunning, or cruel men who survived by preying on the moving veins of gold that were the lifeblood of the Sahara. The desert had no mercy, but its people feared something even greater than its heat. They feared the men who made war with shadows. A desert caravan never slept in peace under a full moon. Its light, as silver and pure as it was, became a beacon of betrayal, turning the silhouettes of men and camels into perfect targets for the raiders who shadowed them from afar. These enemies were not always strangers. Some were Berbers themselves, outlaws cast from their clans, or warriors who had turned to banditry when drought and famine devoured their flocks. Others were Tuareg war parties, swift as desert spirits, who struck under the lunar glow with cries that echoed chillingly across the dunes. The guides would whisper among themselves that the moonlight belonged to thieves. When its pale glow crested the dunes, a quiet tension would fall over the camp. Men would tighten the ropes around the camels' precious loads. snuff out all but a single defiant fire, and postguards with curved daggers glinting in the half-darkness. Those who had survived an ambush told grim stories of shadows crawling like giant beetles toward the sleeping line of beasts, of screams that were swallowed by the wind, of men waking to find half their caravan gone goods stolen, partners slain, or captives dragged away into the unforgiving sands. Yet the Berber guide's greatest weapon was not his blade, it was his belief. Every seasoned guide carried an amulet, often wrapped in gazelle leather, filled with sacred Quranic verses, fragments of bone or sand taken from a holy oasis. Some tied ostrich feathers to their staffs, believing they could deflect the evil eye. Before the grueling dawn marches, they would mutter small prayers to the spirits of the dunes, a powerful blend of Islam with the older desert faiths that predated any written word. In the deep Sahara, faith was as essential as water. Men spoke of jinn that guarded ancient wells, punishing those who dared to lie under oath. They said some dunes were cursed, known to swallow entire caravans whole to avenge an insult made generations before. When a sandstorm rose suddenly from the west, guides often saw it not just as a weather event, but as an omener, stark warning from those buried beneath their feet. These charms were not mere superstition. They were a lifeline, a way to hold on to reason when fear prowled at the edge of the firelight. Every guide knew that a night might come when his courage faltered, when exhaustion blurred his senses. In those terrifying moments, a simple leather charm pressed to his chest could be a powerful reminder of home and of the silent promise he made to return alive. Weapons were a last resort, never displayed openly, for that would only invite suspicion and challenge. A good Berber guide's knife was a part of him, hidden in the folds of his robe or woven into his belt. Its blade curved like a crescent, moon-designed to be quiet and quick. The rule of combat was simple: fight like the Winden scene, and only once. But sometimes a caravan was attacked not by common bandits, but by something far more sinister: slave raiders. These were heavily armed men who traveled the trade routes under false banners, striking with terrifying speed. They captured travelers not for their goods, but for their bodies, to be sold in the far-off markets of the north. It was said that a single cry from a captured guide was enough to freeze the blood of even the most seasoned merchants. For, if the guide fell, the desert itself would finish what the raiders started. Yet, the hunted could sometimes become the hunter. Legends tell of one guide, Tariq of the Three Wells, who turned the tables on his attackers. He lit false campfires across a wide expanse of dunes, creating the illusion of a large, sleeping caravan. As the raiders crept towards the phantom camp, Tariq's men struck from the darkness behind them, melting back into the desert before sunrise. To this day, desert traders whisper his name when they see mysterious, flickering fires in the distance, a potent reminder that even in the darkest night, courage can light a path to survival. Not every enemy came from greed. Some conflicts were born from ancient rivalries, defending territorial lines, drawn not on any map, but marked by memory: a certain well, a cluster of sacred rocks, a lone acacia tree that had stood for centuries. Crossing another tribe's path without offering tribute was a direct challenge, an insult that could easily mean arrows by dawn. To avoid bloodshed, guides often carried gifts: sweet dates, gleaming copper bracelets, or small, precious bags of salt. Negotiation was an art form. One misplaced word, one misunderstood gesture, could ignite a conflict. A guide leading a caravan through multiple tribal zones had to be a diplomat as much as a navigator. He learned greetings in half a dozen languages and mastered codes of honor that shifted as fluidly as the dunes themselves. To an untrained ear, these meetings might have sounded like friendly exchanges over tea. But to the guides, they were tense tests of loyalty and dominance. Subtle duels fought with smiles and carefully chosen words instead of spears. Sometimes, peace required ritual. A drop of fresh milk poured onto the sand, a camel's hoof painted with henna, a promise made under the vast canopy of desert stars. And if those promises were broken, the desert always had its own way of delivering justice. Long after the fires died down to embers and even the camels lay silent, the desert came alive with whispers. Guides swore they could hear voices carried on the wind softly calling their names, or repeating the rhythmic, swaying sounds of the day's journey. Some said it was the dead, the ghosts of lost travelers still wandering the dunes, forever searching for the path home. Others believed it was the desert itself, murmuring in the ancient language of sand, reminding all men that they were merely guests in its vast, silent kingdom. No one truly slept. The guides would sit close to the glowing embers, their eyes staring into the profound darkness. When a sudden gust of wind rose, it sounded like a slow, deep breath. When the dunes shifted in the night, it echoed like the steady, deliberate march of feet. One elder guide famously told his apprentice, "Listen long enough, and you'll hear your own thoughts answering back." The ultimate challenge was to separate illusion from warning. A whisper might be a trick of the wind, or it might be the hushed sound of raiders crawling closer. In the desert, every decision carried the weight of life and death, for hesitation was a fatal mistake. Ultimately, the desert guide bore not just the responsibility of navigation, but of life itself. When threats appeared, be it bandits, rival tribes, or the spectre of starvation, he became the judge, the soldier, and the priest. His word determined who lived and who might be left behind. Sometimes, to save 40 men, he had to make the agonizing choice to abandon one. This was the true cruelty of leadership under the Sahara's silence. Every choice was a wound, and yet no guide could ever show his fear, because fear spread faster than sand in the wind. To his men, he was a rock-silent, steady, unyielding, but inside he carried the ghosts of every soul he couldn't protect. There were times when even his own shadow seemed to frighten him. The desert could twist the mind, turning profound loneliness into vivid hallucination. Some guides claimed to see lost caravans shimmering in the heat haze, their banners waving as if calling them forward onto a false path. Those who were foolish enough to follow the mirage vanished, their tracks swallowed by the dunes within hours. To the Berber guides, survival itself was a sacred test. Each journey across the Sahara was like walking the razor's edge between the world of the living and the realm of the unseen. They learned that the desert taught by Ticunya camel today, a companion tomorrow, and one day, perhaps, their own strength. And yet, with each passage they survived, their names grew heavier with respect. Merchants would tell tales of the guides who could smell water from miles away, who could silence a frightened camel with a single, calming word. But among the guides themselves, true honor came not from triumphs, but from loss endured without complaint. For every coin they earned, there were unmarked graves left behind, shallow hollows in the sand. With a simple prayer whispered above, the desert remembers. At the end of each journey, when the caravan finally reached the bustling city gates, be it Timbuktu, Tagaza, or Sidi el Massaf, the merchants rejoiced. They counted their profits and praised Allah for their safe passage. But the guide rarely joined the celebration. He would find a quiet corner to wash his face, whisper a silent prayer to the wind, and sometimes he would discreetly pour a handful of sand from his pouch onto the ground. It was his way of keeping the pack to return a part of the desert back to itself, so that it might permit him to cross again. To outsiders, it was a strange, meaningless ritual. But to the guide, it was the very essence of survival, because he knew something the traders didn't. The desert always takes its payment. Sometimes it takes gold, sometimes it takes a camel, and sometimes it just waits patiently for the man himself. And so the Berber guide learned to fear not just thirst or heat, but the living silence of the Sahara where even the wind could carry danger. Yet beyond every ambush and every whisper lay a greater prize, the endless routes of trade and the wealth that flowed through them. Every Berber guide knew a deep, unspoken truth. The desert never gave without taking. It took slowly, almost gently, like a debt collected in whispers, a drop of sweat here, a friend there. A piece of your mind lost somewhere between the sunrise and the next dune. For them, survival wasn't a victory. It was a quiet bargain, struck daily between man and sand, between endurance and despair. The first thing the Sahara claimed was moisture. It was a relentless thief. Lips would crack until they bled salt. Skin would peel like ancient papyrus. Even tears, that last luxury of the human soul, vanished into the searing air before they could even fall. To survive, the Berber guides learned to move like ghosts. They spoke little, conserving not just their breath, but thought itself. Every word was a cost. Water became the true measure of time. They didn't count days by sunrises, but by how many skins of water remained. A person can endure hunger, pain, and crushing loneliness, but thirst. Thirst was the great humbler. It stripped away pride, memory, and finally, reason. As the old guides used to say, the desert first dries your mouth, then your heart, and then your dreams. When someone succumbed to thirst, their body would shrink into itself, eyes hollowing, lips turning grey like ash. And yet, no one wept. There was simply no moisture left for grief. Even food was a test of will. Dates, dried meat, hard bread, and sour milk were luxuries reserved for the start of a journey. When those rations thinned, men resorted to chewing the bark of desert shrubs, or even grinding dried camel dung, anything to trick their stomachs into a moment of calm. But the guide's greatest fear was the sound of silence, the day when even the flies vanished, and the dunes sang a desolate song of pure hunger. In those desperate moments, the desert tested loyalty. Men grew suspicious, eyeing each other's meager portions. The strong began to walk ahead, a little faster each day, ignoring the weak who stumbled behind. That was when a true guide revealed himself. He was the one who turned back, who shared his last sip of water, who gave up his own mount so another might live. But not all did. Some caravans pushed on, leaving the fallen to the sand. The guides called it the quiet betrayal, a sin so heavy it was spoken of only in nightmares. It was said that no Berber guide ever finished 10 crossings with all his friends still alive. The desert always claimed one. Sometimes it was the youngest apprentice, too bold to heed the warnings whispered on the wind. Sometimes it was the camel master who lingered behind just a moment too long to fix a broken strap. And sometimes it was the guide's own brother-in-law that created a silence that would follow him for the rest of his days. When a man died on the sands, the burial was brief but sacred. The guides would place a handful of salt on his tongue, whisper a prayer toward Mecca, and cover him with sand mixed with camel hair. It was a symbol, a belief that his body would travel forever, carried across the vast expanse by the wind. They believed the desert didn't keep the dead. It transformed them. They became whispers that moved with the storms, their voices guiding others away from danger. To hear a familiar voice in the wind wasn't madness, it was memory, alive in another form. But some costs were invisible, buried deep inside the mind. The Sahara has a way of rearranging reality. The days stretch on like centuries. Distances lie, the horizon shimmering like a promise that was never meant to be kept. Men began to see things. An oasis that vanished as they drew near. A phantom caravan walking silently beside their own. The faces of loved ones appearing in the shimmering waves of heat. Veteran guides learned to trust rhythm, not sight. They walked step by step, counting their way home in beat-sick strides. A breath, a low hum over and over, until sound replaced sense. It was said that the hum of an old guide could outlast death itself, echoing in the dunes even after his body was gone. And when the mirages grew too strong, some guides would close their eyes and walk blindfolded for miles, trusting their feet more than their vision. Because in the desert, seeing too much was just as dangerous as seeing nothing at all. Leadership came with its own unbearable burden, the ghosts of those who had trusted you. A caravan leader carried more than just maps and compasses. He carried the memory of every wrong decision. If a well they were counting on turned out to be dry, if a sandstorm struck without warning, if a man fell behind and vanished into the dunes, it was the guide's name that haunted the survivors. Some never forgave themselves. They would return to the safety of the mountains and refuse to lead again. Speaking little, their eyes fixed on a distant horizon, even in their sleep. Others became colder, stripped of mercy, obsessed only with precision. They began to measure the world in risks and probabilities, not in people. An ancient proverb said, "The desert makes two kinds of men, the broken and the unfeeling." But both were survivors, and in that brutal landscape, survival was all that mattered. When the caravan finally reached the city Timbuktu, Marrakesh, or Gadam's, the guide's ordeal wasn't over. The merchants celebrated. Gold and salt changed hands. The air filled with laughter, music, and the promise of future wealth. But the guide rarely joined them. He had been too close to death to feel that kind of joy. He would slip away quietly, wash the desert dust from his skin, and find a place to sit alone on the edge of the city. There, beneath the first tree he'd seen in months, he would dig his hands into the soil, cool, soft, and damp, and let the earth remind him he was still alive. Sometimes he would speak softly to the ground, thanking it for letting him return. And yet, even as he rested, he knew the desert was still calling him back. Every true guide carried that pull, an ache that only the endless dunes could quiet. Because, after facing such vast, profound silence, no city ever felt large enough. Years of crossing the Sahara left their mark. Joints stiffened, eyes dimmed from the constant glare. The lungs carried fine grains of sand that no cough could ever expel. But the worst scar was invisible. The constant alertness, that primal instinct to scan the horizon, to count shadows, to distrust a moment of calm weather. Even in sleep, the guides would twitch at the sound of the wind. They could never forget that peace in the desert was always just the moment before disaster. Some became wanderers, unable to stay in one place. Others became teachers, training younger men, passing down maps drawn from memory and warnings etched into stories. Each tale they told carried a cost, for in remembering they had to relive it all. And yet they told them anyway, because silence, too, was dangerous. To forget the desert was to invite it back into your heart, unguarded. When an old Berber guide felt his end approaching, he would often return to the sands one last time. Not with a caravan, but alone on foot, or with a single loyal camel, carrying only a gourd of water and his staff. He would walk until the wind had covered his footprints, erasing his path from the world. No one truly knew what happened after that. Some said the desert swallowed them as gently as sleep. Others believed they became guardians of the dunes, walking forever under the moonlight, invisible to mortal eyes. In the villages along the old trade routes, people said that during sandstorms, if you listen carefully, you can hear the footsteps of the old ones guiding the lost towards safety. And when a caravan survived a storm it shouldn't have, the survivors would whisper. The desert never forgets its guides, it just keeps them hidden. To survive the Sahara was not to conquer it. The desert could not be conquered, it could only be respected. Every guide knew that each crossing was a question, and survival was merely the desert's temporary answer. They never claimed mastery over the dunes. They spoke of the desert as one might speak of a powerful, ancient ruler, unpredictable and always worthy of fear. Survival, at its heart, was an act of humility. It meant understanding that you were nothing but a moving shadow between sunrise and sunset, that to reach the next oasis, you needed not strength, but surrender. And so, when the desert finally released its survivors, they carried more than dust in their lungs, they carried its silence in their souls. Yet, what drove them to return again and again was not madness, but mastery. The secret art of reading stars, winds, and sand. Let us now follow them into that mystery. To someone who doesn't know it, the desert seems like pure emptiness, a vast, shimmering nothing. But for the Berbers, it was a living map, a tapestry woven with secret paths, wells remembered by name, and dunes that shifted like moods but never lost their meaning. From Sijil Massa in the north, a city with walls that glowed red under the Atlas sun, all the way to the black soils of the Niger Bend in the south, stretched the beating arteries of empire. Through these arteries pulsed salt, gold, and stories, and it was the Berbers who kept that pulse alive. These caravan routes weren't straight lines on a map. They were more like veins, bending to avoid danger and reach the next life-saving sip of water. The most famous route began in Sijil Massa, a Moroccan trading city founded way back in the 8th century. From there, merchants and guides rode southward across the Sahara, heading for places like Timbuktu, Gao, and Tagazames that still hum with myth, but once hummed with commerce. Each route had its own logic. The western one, from Sijil Massa to Kaumbisela, skirted the deadliest dunes and past oases where date palms shaded weary men. The central route, the lifeline to Timbuktu and Gao, was riskier. It had longer stretches without water, harsher winds, and the constant whisper of Tuareg raids. But the rewards? Unthinkable. Gold dust by the bag, ivory by the tusk. The pulse of kingdoms moving through a desert so wide it could swallow armies. Choosing a route was an ancient art, part science, part prayer. The wells weren't random. They were catalogued, memorized, and guarded. A Berber guide could list them in his sleep. Bur, Elkanum, Tazroki, Arawan each, a promise of life in the land of thirst. He knew which salt pits were safe, which dunes hid ambushes, and which clans controlled each oasis. To travel without this knowledge was suicide. And yet, these same guides rarely owned what they carried. The salt, the gold, the textiles, they all belonged to merchants from Fez, Tlemcen, or Tunis. Men who sat in shaded courtyards counting profits while the Berbers faced the wind. Still, the desert respected the guides more than the merchants. Because in the Sahara, money couldn't buy survival memory. Could? Each major kingdom Ghana, Mali, Songhairos, and fell in rhythm with these arteries. When a route flourished, a kingdom flourished. When sand swallowed an oasis, a city could die within a generation. Trade was the breath of civilization, and the Berbers were the lungs. They became the invisible lifeline between West Africa's goldfields and North Africa's markets. Gold dust from the forests of Wangara found its way into the minting halls of Marrakesh. Salt mined by slaves into Gaza preserved food for empires thousands of miles away. Ivory, carved into caliphs' thrones, passed through their hands, and through it all, the Berbers left almost no trace, no monuments, no palaces, just footprints erased by the next wind. When European travelers later wrote about the mysterious black kingdoms of gold, they rarely mentioned the Berber caravans that made those kingdoms visible. But under the burning silence of the Sahara, it was the Berbers who stitched Africa together. By the 13th century, the desert had become a highway of wealth. At its busiest, hundreds of camels moved in a single file, carrying tons of salt north and gold south. The routes were marked by bonesmen who had lost their way, or water, or both. Yet, year after year, they kept walking. Because, for a Berber, the desert wasn't empty, it was home. And home always calls you back. They moved by instinct, guided by the stars and the language of the sand. A ripple here meant wind from the west. A pattern of stones hinted at an ancient path. Even the silence had toned the way it changed before a sandstorm, or the sound of a camel's breath before dawn. Every movement was a decision, every mistake a death sentence. And still they sang. Low chants that matched the rhythm of the camels, songs about salt and stars and the smell of water after 3 days of none. The songs became maps, and the maps became memory. The arteries of empire, the desert's veins, they all carried not just goods, but dreams. Dreams of cities built from gold. Dreams of children who would never know the taste of thirst. Dreams that only the Berbers dared to chase. When we talk about African gold, we picture glittering coins, golden masks, and royal thrones. But in truth, the most valuable cargo crossing the desert wasn't gold at all. It was salt, the quiet miracle of survival. In the salt pits of Tagaza, the air stung the skin. The entire town was built from salt blocks, the walls, the mosques, even the graves. Slaves worked there, their bodies crusted white, cutting slabs with iron tools under a sun that never forgave. Every block was loaded onto camels and carried south, where it was often traded pound for gold dust. In some years, salt was worth more than gold. Without it, no meat could last, no body could live. In the empire of Mali, salt was currency, status, and medicine. But salt was only the beginning. The desert carried treasures that told the story of a continent's hunger and imagination. Ivory from the forests of Guinea, ostrich feathers plucked for royal fans, copper from Takeda, slaves from the Sahel, and cola nuts bitter, stimulating, and beloved by kings and travelers alike. Each product had its own rhythm of trade. Gold traveled south to north, salt north to south. Ivory went in both directions, like the flow of ambition itself. Cola, not small but powerful, became the caffeine of empires. Even when the trade was cruel, it was efficient, ordered, almost ritualistic. Every caravan was a gamble. A single lost route could mean the death of hundreds of men and the bankruptcy of a merchant family. But the reward, if successful, could build dynasties. A caravan leaving Tagaza might take 2 months to reach Timbuktu. Every single day it risked wind, thirst, and raiders. And yet, those who made it alive returned with wealth heavy enough to buy cities. The economics of risk defined the Sahara trade. There was no insurance, no rescue team, only trust and calculation. Merchants invested everything: their gold, their camels, their sons. Some hired Berber guides, not for their loyalty, but for their superstition, believing that a man who prayed to the wind could never be lost. Others simply paid bribes to tribal chiefs along the way, buying safe passage through invisible borders. But wealth never traveled alone. It came with tension between those who carried it and those who coveted it. Raiders hid among dunes, waiting for silhouettes at dusk. Some would pretend to be lost travelers until night fell and swords flashed. The Berbers learned to fight in silence. Their blades curved like the crescent moons that guided them. Even kings respected the caravans. Mansa Musa, the legendary ruler of Mali, built his empire on these same routes. When he made his pilgrimage to Mecca in the 14th century, his caravan stretched beyond side camels carrying gold dust, servants, and scholars. The world learned then what the Berbers already knew. The desert was not a barrier, it was a bridge. To move wealth through the sands was to defy nature, to turn thirst into fortune, emptiness into empire. And the Berbers, hardened by centuries of motion, became the masters of that defiance. When you picture the treasures of ancient Africa, what comes to mind? Glittering gold coins, the golden death mask of a pharaoh, maybe a king's magnificent throne, forged from pure gold. These images are powerful, but they only tell half the story. The truth is, for centuries, the most valuable cargo crossing the vast Sahara Desert wasn't gold at all. It was something far more essential, far more miraculous. It was salt. Yes, salt, that simple white crystal on your dinner table, was once the lifeblood of empires. It was the quiet miracle of survival in a world without refrigeration. Imagine the salt pits of Targaza, a place so remote and harsh it feels like another planet. The air itself is salty, stinging your skin and eyes. In this desolate landscape, an entire town was built from the very commodity it produced. The walls of the houses, the mosques where people prayed, even the graves for the dead all, were carved from solid blocks of salt. The labor was brutal. Enslaved people toiled under a relentless, unforgiving sun, their bodies perpetually crusted in white. With heavy iron tools, they cut massive slabs of salt from the earth. Each block, weighing as much as a grown man, was then loaded onto the backs of camels, beginning a perilous journey south across the desert. Why go to all this trouble? Because in the markets of West Africa, this salt was worth a fortune. It was traded pound for pound for gold dust. In some years, salt was even more valuable than gold. Think about it. Without salt, meat would spoil within days. The human body itself cannot function without it, especially in a hot climate. In the great empire of Mali, salt wasn't just a seasoning. It was currency. It was a status symbol. It was medicine. It was life itself. But salt was just the beginning of the story. The caravans that braved the Sahara carried a whole universe of treasures, each one telling a different tale of the continent's desires, needs, and incredible imagination. From the deep forests of Guinea came ivory, carved from the tusks of elephants and destined for palaces in Europe and the Middle East. Ostrich feathers, plucked for the extravagant fans of royalty, were another prized commodity. From the mines of Takeda came shimmering copper, essential for tools and art. And then there were the people. Tragically, the caravans also transported enslaved individuals, captured in the Sahel region and sold into servitude across North Africa and beyond. And alongside all this, a small, unassuming treasure, the kola nut. Bitter to the taste, but powerfully stimulating, kola nuts were the caffeine fix of empires, beloved by kings, scholars, and weary travelers alike. They were chewed to ward off fatigue on long journeys and offered as a sign of hospitality and respect. Each of these products moved in a specific rhythm, a grand, choreographed dance of commerce across the sands. Gold generally traveled from the rich mines of West Africa northward toward the Mediterranean. Salt, as we know, made the opposite journey, moving from the northern mines south. Ivory flowed in both directions, a testament to its universal appeal, following the currents of ambition itself. This trade, while often built on cruelty and exploitation, was astonishingly efficient, highly organized, and almost ritualistic in its execution. The desert routes were the arteries of an entire continent. Of course, every single caravan was a monumental gamble. A journey across the Sahara wasn't a casual trip. It was a life-or-death expedition. A single wrong turn, a dried-up well, or a sudden sandstorm could spell doom for hundreds of people and bankrupt an entire merchant family. A caravan leaving the salt mines of Tagaza might take 2 full months to reach the legendary city of Timbuktu. Every single day was a battle against the elements, the searing wind, the crushing thirst, and the constant threat of raiders. But the rewards, the rewards were legendary. For those who survived the journey, the profits could be immense. A successful merchant could return with enough wealth to build palaces, fund armies, and establish dynasties that would last for generations. The economics of the Sahara were defined by this high-stakes game of risk and reward. There was no insurance, no rescue service. Survival depended on a combination of deep knowledge, careful calculation, and unwavering trust in your guides and companions. Merchants invested everything they had, their gold, their camels, and often their own sons, who would learn the trade on these perilous journeys. The relationship with their guides was critical. Many merchants hired Berber guides not just for their unparalleled knowledge of the desert, but for their spiritual beliefs. They thought that a man who prayed to the wind and read the stars could never truly be lost. Others were more pragmatic, simply paying hefty bribes to tribal chiefs along the route, buying safe passage through invisible territories and political borders. But wealth never travels alone. It always brings tension and danger. Raiders, often nomadic tribes who knew the desert as well as the merchants, would hide among the dunes, waiting for the telltale silhouettes of a caravan against the dusk sky. Some would pose as lost travelers, begging for water and shelter, only to reveal their true intentions when the camp was asleep and swords flashed in the moonlight. In response, the Berber guards became masters of silent combat, their curved blades moving as swiftly and silently as the desert wind, often shaped like the crescent moons that guided them through the night. The power of these caravans was so immense that even kings had to respect them. The great Mansa Musa, the legendary ruler of the Mali Empire and possibly the richest person in all of human history, built his unimaginable fortune on these very same trade routes. When he made his famous pilgrimage to Mecca in the 14th century, his caravan was a sight to behold. It was said to stretch as far as the eye could see, a moving city of tens of thousands of soldiers, servants, and scholars. And the camels, thousands upon thousands of them, each laden with pouches of pure gold dust. Mansa Musa's journey quite literally changed the global economy. He distributed so much gold in cities like Cairo that its value plummeted and did unrecover for over a decade. His pilgrimage announced to the world what the Berbers and the desert merchants already knew. The Sahara was not a barrier, it was a bridge. It was a vibrant, dynamic conduit connecting West Africa with North Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. To move wealth across those endless sands was to perform an act of defiance against nature itself. It was to turn thirst into fortune, and to transform a vast, perceived emptiness into the foundation of empires. And the Berbers, a people hardened by centuries of constant motion, living in rhythm with the sun and the sand, became the undisputed masters of that defiance. They were the navigators, the guards, and the brokers of this incredible story, writing their legacy not in stone, but in the shifting sands of time. Imagine crossing a sea of sand, 1,000 miles of burning sun and biting wind, with nothing but the stars and the whispers of your ancestors to guide you. For the Berber guides of the Sahara, this wasn't an adventure, it was life itself. And at the end of this grueling journey, the reward wasn't just survival. It was a destination that shimmered like a mirage, but was astonishingly real. Timbuktu, Gao, and Walata. These were the legendary cities where the desert finally surrendered to the life-giving waters of the Niger River, where trade blossomed into civilization. In these bustling hubs, the silence of the dunes was replaced by a symphony of human connection. The air itself seemed to vibrate with 1,000 different stories. You'd hear the melodic flow of Arabic, the rhythmic cadence of Sunink, the powerful tones of Songhai, and the intricate dialects of Mand and Fulani. It was a linguistic melting pot, a place where a merchant from Fez could converse with a scholar from Cairo and a trader from the forests of the south. The markets weren't just contained within walls. They spilled out into the streets, a vibrant, chaotic, and beautiful tapestry of human enterprise. The scent of exotic spices, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the clean, dry scent of the desert. Everywhere you looked, there was movement. Camels, the magnificent ships of the desert, knelt with weary groans as their precious cargo was carefully untied. Slabs of salt, worth their weight in gold, were stacked next to bolts of vibrant cloth, bags of life-sustaining grain, and intricately crafted leather goods. In the shaded courtyards, you might see scholars, their robes flowing deep in debate over theological texts, their animated gestures a silent language of their own. Just a few feet away, a goldsmith would be meticulously hammering out delicate ornaments. The rhythmic tap-tap, a constant beat against the city's hum. For a Berber guide walking through these cities, it was like feeling the pulse of the entire African continent right beneath his feet. He was the vital link, the human thread connecting disparate worlds. To the outside world, especially in Europe, Timbuktu was more myth than reality. A city of gold, a lost kingdom of immense wealth and wisdom, spoken of in hushed, envious tones. But for the Berber guides, Timbuktu wasn't a legend. It was a checkpoint, a crucial node in their vast network. They knew its labyrinthine alleys like the back of their own weathered hands. They understood the unspoken codes of the merchants, the subtle nod that sealed a deal, the shift in tone that signaled a negotiation was complete. Their primary role was to deliver the salt, the white gold of the Sahara, mined under brutal conditions in places like Tagaz. They would hand over their cargo to brokers, who would then facilitate the exchange for goods from the south. In return for their perilous journey, they received the essentials for the journey back and for their families: grain, cloth, dates, and sometimes a few precious coins. On rare, fortunate occasions, when the trade was particularly profitable and the gods smiled upon them, they might be paid in gold dust. Small, soft leather pouches filled with glittering particles, each one a tiny promise of a slightly easier future. It was a tangible link to the immense wealth that flowed through these cities, a wealth they helped create but rarely partook in. But their true, most fundamental payment was something far more elemental: survival. The moment a trade was concluded, there was no time for celebration or rest. The clock was already ticking. The desert waited, and it was just as unforgiving on the return journey. Immediately, the planning began for another 1,000-mile trek through the ever-shifting dunes. There was no leisure time to linger in the cool shade of the grand mosques or to listen to the storytellers in the market square. While the scholars of Timbuktu were meticulously copying ancient manuscripts by candlelight, preserving the knowledge of generations, the Berber guides were engaged in the practical work of staying alive. They were mending worn-out saddles, patching leather waterskins, and meticulously calculating their rations. Every drop of water, every handful of grain was accounted for. A single miscalculation could mean the difference between life and death. A Berber guide was so much more than a simple navigator. His skill set was incredibly diverse, honed by generations of experience. He was a savvy broker, understanding the fluctuating values of goods across vast distances. He was a gifted linguist, able to switch seamlessly between different languages and dialects to build rapport and negotiate terms. He was also a skilled diplomat. The desert was not empty. It was home to various tribes and clans, like the formidable Tuareg, who often controlled key routes and oases. A guide knew precisely how to approach them, how to negotiate safe passage, not through force, but through respect, established protocols, and sometimes a share of the goods. He knew the formal greetings required for a Songhai king and could effortlessly translate prices between Arabic and Mand, ensuring fairness and trust. His loyalty wasn't to a single king or empire. It was to a much older, much more powerful master, the desert itself. At night, after the day's work was done, a guide might find a quiet spot near the banks of the Niger River. He would sit and stare at its dark, shimmering surface, a stark, flowing contrast to the static, sandy world he knew so well. He might think of the great sea, the ocean he had heard tales of but would likely never see. The sounds of the city would drift towards him on the cool night, ere the distant, rhythmic pounding of drums from the markets, the chorus of frogs from the riverbanks. Civilization pulsed all around him. He was, at its very heart, witnessing gold changing hands. Powerful ideas crossing borders on the backs of his camels, and scribes preserving words of men who had never felt the sting of a sandstorm. And yet, in the midst of it all, he remained a shadow. He was the man who carried entire worlds on his shoulders, but owned almost nothing within them. He was the conduit for immense wealth, but his own earnings were measured in survival. His name was rarely written down in the grand chronicles of empires. His face, weathered by sun and wind, would fade from memory, just like the footprints he left in the sand, destined to be erased by the next breeze. But it is a profound truth that without these anonymous, hard-working men, the vibrant markets of Timbuktu and Gao would have fallen silent. The cities themselves, starved of trade, resources, and the new ideas that came with them, would have withered. Civilization, in any era, depends on these unseen hands. The people who perform the essential, often grueling, work that allows society to function and flourish. The Berbers were those hands for the great empires of West Africa. And when the world's winds shifted, when new sea routes were discovered by European explorers, the trans-Saharan trade began to decline. The lifeblood of the desert arteries slowed to a trickle. The consequences were inevitable. Timbuktu's legendary libraries, once centers of learning for the entire Islamic world, saw their precious manuscripts turn to dust. Gao's busy river ports fell silent and empty. The salt mines of Tagaza were abandoned, their deep shafts left to the ghosts of the workers. The pulse of empire stopped. But in the profound silence that followed, as the great cities crumbled, one thing remained constant. The Berbers still walked. They continued to move, to guide, to survive, just as they always had. Their world had changed. The great wealth had vanished, but their relationship with the desert remained. Because the desert, in its timeless wisdom, has no memory for wealth or for empires. It doesn't remember the names of kings or the value of gold. It only remembers the courage, the resilience, and the spirit of those who dared to cross it. At night, when the desert becomes an ocean of silence, the sky opens like a map, infinite, ancient, and precise. The Berber people, The Imazigan called it their second Earth, for it held the same paths, the same memory. While others feared the darkness, they waited for it. Because under those stars, direction was truth. The Sahara sky is not still, it moves, it glitters, it whispers. The Berber guides learned to read it the way poets read verses. The brilliant star Canopus, hanging low on the horizon, marked the route to the southern lands. Sirius, blazing with a fierce white light, guided those seeking the great river Niger. And Polaris, the North Star, anchored every traveler's heart, steady, unblinking, eternal. When the sun burned the world by day, it erased all landmarks, turning the landscape into a featureless canvas of heat and light. But when the sky returned, the path came alive again. They had no compasses, no astrolabes, no instruments but memory and the keenest observation. Yet, a master guide could cross 2,000 kilometers of treacherous desert and arrive within a day of his prediction. To outsiders, it looked like sorcery. To the Berbers, it was discipline, the science of the soul. The sky was a language spoken in light and shadow. The first light of dawn told of direction. The lingering light of dusk told of distance. Even the color of twilight held secrets, revealing the presence of moisture in the air, hinting at a nearby oasis, or warning of a storm waiting to be born. The stars themselves shimmered differently depending on what lay beneath them. A flicker over sand was distinct from a flicker over stone. Every twinkle, every shift in color meant something. The constellations weren't just cold, distant names from a textbook. They were stories with personalities, with moods, living narratives that made the act of navigation unforgettable. To pass down this knowledge, Berber elders would tell tales around the crackling fire before each long journey. Canopus, they would say, is the stern elder. Follow him south, but do not look him in the eye for too long. He burns the eyes of liars. Sirius, they would explain, is the loyal hound. He runs ahead of you, guarding the caravan from harm. And of Polaris, they would whisper, she is the patient one, unmoving, silent, but always watching over you. Each star was a teacher, and each story was a compass. In the vast emptiness of the desert, science and myth were not enemies. They were twins, walking hand in hand. To remember was to survive. It was that simple. So, when a child was old enough to walk beside the camels, their father or uncle would begin the sacred teaching. He would point to the heavens and introduce the child to the sky. One star each week, one story at a time. The child learned that the great misty band across the sky, the Milky Way, was the sand river of the heavens, a celestial mirror of the Niger River flowing on the earth below. He learned to tell when dawn was near, not by the first hint of light, but by the faint, almost imperceptible change in the wind's direction, the very breath of morning stirring the world awake. To the untrained eye, the desert night sky looked like a chaotic, beautiful mess of countless stars. It was overwhelming, endless, but to a Berber guide, it looked like a script written by the gods, and he knew how to read every single word. A well-trained guide possessed a skill that bordered on the supernatural. He could navigate through blinding sandstorms, through weeks of traversing featureless, monotonous terrain, relying on nothing but his internal sense of where the stars should be. Even when thick clouds veiled the heavens for days, he remembered their rhythm, the precise arc they made across the sky between dusk and dawn. In his mind, he carried the entire sky like a perfectly calibrated clock. This deep, ingrained memory was considered sacred. If a guide ever became too proud, believing his skill alone was enough to protect him, the desert had a way of correcting him swiftly and often harshly. As the Berber proverb warns, he who forgets to thank the stars forgets where he is. For them, navigation wasn't just about movement from one point to another. It was a form of respect, a continuous dialogue with the cosmos. The stars were not mere tools to be used and discarded. They were companions, guides, and guardians on a journey that was as much spiritual as it was physical. Every night spent under their silent watch was a reminder of one's place in a universe far greater than oneself. It was this humility, this deep connection, that allowed them to not just survive the Sahara, but to call it home. By day, when the sun blotted out the stars, the Berbers turned their attention to the earth. But they didn't see it as mere ground. To them, it was another kind of map, a living document written in sand and stone. To the Berber people, every single dune had a personality. Some were shy, moving with a slow, deliberate grace over the months. Others were restless, wild spirits that could shift dramatically overnight, redrawing the landscape in a single gust of wind. Each pattern, each delicate ripple etched into the sand by the breeze, spoke of direction. A trained foot, calloused and sensitive from a lifetime of walking, could feel the subtle change in a slope and know which way the wind had been blowing for weeks. The Sahara wasn't just a place, it was alive, and the Berbers listened to its whispers through the soles of their feet. Even the rocks, scattered across the vast emptiness, carried memory. Sharp, black volcanic stones marked ancient lava fields, treacherous terrain that would tear at a camel's feet and slow a caravan to a crawl. In contrast, soft, pale dunes often hinted at the presence of hidden water nearby, a life-giving secret whispered from the earth. The Berbers named these places not as points on a map, but as old, familiar friends: Adra, Insala, Tanes Ruft. These weren't just names. They were words that held entire maps inside them, stories of danger, oases, and safe passage. An elder might kneel, the sun casting long shadows, and with a simple stick, draw a complex route in the sand, a map as fleeting as the wind, yet as reliable as the sunrise. Along these invisible highways stood Karen's humble piles of stones that marked paths imperceptible to the untrained eye. Each Karen told a story. It spoke of who had passed, when they had passed, and sometimes whether they had survived the journey. Some cairns bore the stark, sun-bleached traces of camel bones, left intentionally as grim beacons. They were a clear, unspoken warning. Here lies thirst. Do not linger. Others were far more subtle. A specific line of 3 stones might mean turn east at the next ridge, while a single hollowed-out stone could signify that a life-saving oasis was just ahead. In this harsh environment, nothing was wasted. Every sign, no matter how small, mattered deeply. Even the smell of the air was a guide. The Berbers, with their senses honed by generations of survival, could detect the faint, humid scent of water on the wind long before any patch of green was visible on the horizon. Some seasoned guides even claimed they could determine their location and the distance to the next well by the feel of the sand alone. Smooth, fine sand indicated wind-exposed dunes, open and vast. Coarse, heavier grains suggested sheltered valleys and the potential for hidden wells. To the modern mind, accustomed to GPS and digital maps, this sounds almost impossible, a feat of magic. But for generations of barefoot travelers, instinct was a more trustworthy guide than sight. They learned to read the desert not with their eyes, but with their entire bodies, trusting the subtle messages conveyed through their feet, their skin, and the air they breathed. This incredible knowledge was never written down. It was a living library, passed from father to son, uncle to nephew, from a master guide to their apprentice. It was always spoken, shared in hushed tones around a flickering campfire, or whispered on the back of a swaying camel. The desert demanded humility, and the act of writing was seen as too proud, too permanent for a landscape that constantly shifted, erased, and remade itself. The Berbers believed that this wisdom was a sacred inheritance, a gift from the land itself. To share it with outsiders, and especially to write it down, was considered taboo. They feared that once this knowledge was recorded, it would lose its power, its sacred connection to the land. They believed the desert would see such an act as arrogance and would punish the bearer, leading them astray. And so, this knowledge lived in memory. It was oral, fluid, and holy, changing slightly with each telling but never losing its core truth. When night fell and the brutal heat of the day gave way to a profound, chilling cold, families would gather around their fires. The flames would dance, casting flickering light on the faces of the young and old. It was then that the elder guides would tell stories to their sons and nephews. They spoke of the dunes as if they were living beings, with moods and intentions. The dunes near Tanasrooft, one might say, his voice a low rumble. They have bad tempers. They shift out of spite, trying to confuse travelers. He'd pause, letting the image sink in. But the ones near in Salar, they are kind. They will keep you safe if you rest in their shadows during the heat of the day. The children would listen, sometimes laughing at the personification of the sand. But they were absorbing more than just stories. They were memorizing a map. By the time they reached adulthood, these fantastical tales had solidified into a complex set of coordinates, a mental atlas of the Sahara. When they, in turn, grew old, they would pass these same stories on to the next generation, perhaps slightly changed, a bit more poetic, but always accurate. In this way, the map of the Sahara was sung across centuries, a continuous, unbroken melody of survival. It was never written, and because of that, it was never truly lost. Today, when archaeologists and historians walk those ancient routes, they still find the faint, ghostly trails left behind by these master navigators. They discover stones aligned in patterns that no random gust of wind could ever create. They unearth the bones of camels that died hundreds of years ago, their remains still marking the direction they were walking, silent sentinels guarding the path. These were not accidents. They were deliberate signposts, messages left for those who would come after, a testament to a shared journey across time. The Berbers didn't build pyramids or grand temples to be remembered. Their monuments were humble and practical bones and stones, whispers on the wind, and footprints in the sand. They were small things, ephemeral things, yet they have outlasted entire kingdoms. Because the desert, after all, rewards humility. It remembers those who walk lightly upon it, those who listen to its voice, and those who respect its power. It holds their stories in its shifting sands, a timeless tribute to a people who learned not to conquer the wilderness, but to become a part of it. There were times when even the most seasoned guides found themselves in situations where skill alone could unexplain their survival. Moments when the wind shifted direction without a whisper of warning, when a wall of sand devoured the horizon in an instant, when every star vanished from the sky and not a single cairn marked the way forward. In these moments, the Berbers would say, "The desert is speaking." To an outsider, this might sound like simple superstition, a folksy saying to make sense of the inexplicable, but for those who lived their lives by the rhythms of the sand, it was a profound recognition, direct communication between the traveler and the land itself. The desert wasn't just a place. It was a living entity, a spirit with its own moods, capable of both extraordinary mercy and terrifying wrath. A guide who had learned to truly listen could hear the desert's warnings long before disaster struck. He would often pause mid-journey, his face turned towards the vast emptiness. He might lift a handful of sand, letting it trickle through his fingers, observing the way it drifted on the air. This simple act could tell him whether a storm was gathering strength just beyond the curve of the earth. He would close his eyes, not to rest, but to feel the wind, its temperature, its scent, its subtle vibration against his skin. Some of the most gifted guides were said to hear the dunes shifting miles away, a low, deep hum that was imperceptible to others. The signs were everywhere, if you knew how to read them. When birds flew low at dawn, skimming the tops of the dunes, it was a sure sign that water was near. But when the silence grew to deep, not just quiet, but a thick, heavy quiet that seemed to press in on you, it was an omen. It meant a storm was building its power just behind the horizon, preparing to unleash its fury. They called this practice hearing the desert. It wasn't magic, not in the way an outsider might think. It was a state of awareness, sharpened to the very edge of instinct. It was the art of being utterly and completely present in the moment, attuned to every subtle shift in the environment. But alongside this heightened awareness, there was a deeply spiritual side to their craft. Before embarking on any long and perilous journey, Berber guides would perform small rituals of respect. They might spill a few precious drops of water onto the ground, an offering for the jinn, the spirits of the sands. Or they would whisper a prayer to the wind before crossing a particularly notorious stretch of desert like the Tanazrufta name that translates to the land of thirst. They held a core belief. Those who respected the desert, who showed it humility, would be guided safely through its trials. But those who boasted of their skill or hurried impatiently would be claimed by it, buried beneath its shifting sands. The Sahara, they said, remembers who walks gently and who doesn't. To navigate the desert was not merely to move from one point to another. It was to merge with it, to become part of its vast, silent dance. A great guide could walk for days in what seemed like a trance-like state of focus. With eyes half closed, he moved with an uncanny certainty, hearing rhythms that others couldn't perceive. The gentle sway of the camels, the soft crunch of sand underfoot, the constant, sighing pulse of the wind, all these elements merged into a form of moving meditation. It was said that these guides entered a unique state, somewhere between waking and dreaming. Their conscious mind would fall silent, but their body, guided by years of experience and deep instinct, moved with perfect precision. They became, as the old saying goes, part of the dunes. This was not a skill that could be easily taught in a few lessons. It was earned. It came only after years of profound silence, of enduring solitude, and of experiencing heartbreaking loss. It came only after the desert had tested you, pushed you to your limits, and broken you, and yet you still found the strength to keep walking. And sometimes, in these moments of deep connection, the desert answered back. Guides would share stories, often in hushed tones, around a campfire, of strange lights appearing in the dead of night. These spectral glows would move alongside the caravan for a time, pacing them through the darkness, before vanishing as mysteriously as they had appeared. They spoke of hearing voices calling out from distant dunes, voices that no one else in the caravan could hear. The elders passed down a stern warning. Never follow such voices. They were the echoes of lost travelers, their spirits still searching for the path they never found. To survive the Sahara, a guide had to master the delicate art of discernment. They had to know the difference between what was real and what was a mirage shimmering on the horizon, between the projections of their own tired mind and the true whispers of the desert. In this way, navigation became more than a physical skill. It became a form of spirituality. The desert tested not just your memory of landmarks and stars, but your humility, your patience, and your respect for a power far greater than yourself. It demanded a perfect balance, a combination of hard-won knowledge and a willingness to surrender, of precise calculation and unwavering faith. So, when the Berbers said, "The desert spoke," it was a statement of profound significance. What they truly meant was, "The land has noticed you. It is aware of your presence. Now walk wisely." To a modern historian, Berber navigation might look like an early, unwritten science, practical application of astronomy, geology, and meteorology. To a traveler who has witnessed it firsthand, it feels like nothing short of a miracle, a supernatural ability to read the mind of the wilderness. But to a Berber, it was neither science nor miracle. It was simply living in rhythm with a land that could kill or bless in equal measure. It was a partnership built on a lifetime of listening. And when a guide and his caravan finally reached their destination, the lush green edges of the Niger River or the life-giving shade of a palm-fringed oasis, there would be no loud celebration, no shouts of triumph. Instead, the guide would quietly dismount, touch the ground with his hand, and whisper a few words of thanks. He would rest in silence, his heart full of gratitude, because he knew with absolute certainty that the desert was still listening. In the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Sahara, there were men whose names became maps. When merchants whispered of safe passage, they didn't speak of routes or oases. They spoke of people, of the few who could cross the desert and return alive year after year, storm after storm. These were not just guides, they were the kings of the sand. To be a great Berber guide was to stand above merchants, above soldiers, and sometimes even above sultans. You carried the memory of empires in your mind, the fate of entire caravans resting on your shoulders. A single wrong decision could doom fortunes worth kingdoms. But a right one could open trade routes that would forever change the course of history. Imagine a man standing on a dune ridge, his caravan a long, snaking line behind him, silhouetted against a burning gold horizon. This was his kingdom. Men like Tariq of the North Wind, they said, could smell rain days before it fell. They could feel the subtle shift of the dunes as if it were a change in the heartbeat of the earth itself. Many were known not by their given names, but by titles earned in the furnace of the desert. The compass of Timbuktu, the one who talks to stars, the dune whisperer. Merchants, desperate for their expertise, paid them in gold, in camels, or sometimes in reverent silence, because even spoken gratitude could feel disrespectful to men who walked the line between life and death every single day. The greatest among them were courted by sultans and chiefs. Before launching a royal expedition or marching an army into battle, rulers would seek their blessings, believing that the desert itself obeyed their moods. In the bustling markets of Fez, in the grand courts of Marrakesh, in the legendary city of Gao, wherever traders gathered to plan their perilous journeys, one question decided everything: who will lead? If the answer was a name known across the sands, a palpable sense of relief would fill the room. Men would commit their lives and fortunes to the journey. But if the guide was unknown, or if no great guide could be found, even the bravest merchants would refuse to leave the safety of the city walls. The power of a Berber guide wasn't written in royal decrees or etched onto stone tablets. It was earned in the vast, profound silence between the dunes. Every step he took carried an immense weight. When he pointed toward a seemingly empty horizon, thousands followed without question. He held the power of life and death in his hands. He could choose to save a struggling caravan or abandon it to its fate. He could reveal the location of a hidden, life-saving well, or pretend not to know of its existence, preserving it for a future, more desperate time. This immense power was never spoken of. It was an unspoken truth that hung in the dry desert air, but everyone felt it. And yet, for all this influence, these men lived with profound simplicity. He wore simple leather sandals, often made by his own hands, and was wrapped in indigo cloth that mirrored the deep blues and purples of the desert at dusk. His true wealth was not in gold or jewels, but in knowledge, an invisible, untouchable, and utterly priceless treasure. It was a wealth stored not in chests, but in memory and instinct. Picture the scene at night. The caravan has made camp. The camels are resting, and the merchants are gathered around small fires, arguing over the price of salt, the quality of textiles, the profits to be made. But the guide sits slightly apart from them all, a solitary figure wrapped in his burnous, his eyes fixed on the brilliant tapestry of stars above. He didn't need to boast of his skills or recount his triumphs. He didn't need to. The desert itself, in its silence and its survival, testified for him. A good guide could earn riches and live a comfortable life. But a legendary one whose name was whispered with awe from one end of the Sahara to the other, earned something far greater: immortality. As stories of their incredible journeys spread from oasis to oasis, from market to dusty market, they became the stuff of legend. Mothers would hush their children with tales that were both warnings and lessons in virtue. "Do not lie," they would say, "for the desert listens. It remembers the steps of the guides of the wind." The desert was not just sand and rock. It was a living entity, a witness to all deeds, and the guides were its chosen sons, its interpreters. In the great cities of trade, these guides were treated as oracles, seen as beings who were half human, half elemental force of nature. Chiefs and wealthy patrons gifted them fine horses and even wives from their own families. Poets composed long, elaborate songs celebrating their journeys, their wisdom, and their courage. It was said that sometimes even kings and sultans would dismount from their horses as a sign of deep respect when one of these legendary guides entered the royal court. It was a gesture of acknowledging a power that transcended earthly titles and political authority. But it's crucial to understand they were not rulers of men. They did not command armies or legislate laws. Their dominion was over something far more fundamental, far more primal. They were rulers of the path, and in a world defined by the journey, in a life that depended on finding the way that made them eternal. Their legacy wasn't carved in stone monuments that would crumble to dust, but in the safe passage of generations, in the continued flow of culture and commerce across an impossible landscape. They were the living soul of the Sahara, the silent kings whose kingdom was the journey itself. Have you ever considered what real power looks like? It's not always loud. It's not always dressed in gold or seated on a throne. Sometimes the greatest power is found in silence. In the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Sahara, there once existed a group of men whose authority was absolute, yet they rarely spoke a word. These were the desert guides, the true masters of the dunes. Their strength wasn't in eloquent speeches or commanding shouts. It was in a profound silence that others often mistook for coldness or indifference. But it was far from that. It was mastery. In the desert, every breath is precious, and every spoken word can breed confusion. A dangerous luxury when your life depends on clarity. For these guides, a single, deliberate look was enough. A subtle raise of the hand, a slight tilt of the head, these were the commands that moved entire caravans, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, across the world's most formidable landscape. Imagine the scene, a long line of camels and merchants stretching for miles, kicking up a golden haze under the relentless sun. At the head of this procession walks a man, weathered by wind and sun, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He doesn't shout orders, he doesn't consult maps, he simply moves, and an entire ecosystem of trade and travel moves with him, trusting his every step. These men carried no banners, no fancy insignia of their rank. Their authority didn't come from a king or a sultan. It came from something far more valuable: trust. This trust was earned, not given. It was built over entire lifetimes of unerring accuracy, of unshakable courage in the face of sandstorms and raiders, and of an ever-present air of mystery. If you were to ask a merchant who had walked beside one of these guides for weeks, they'd likely tell you the same thing. He doesn't talk much, but when he does, everyone listens. Every rare word was a pearl of wisdom, a critical instruction, a life-saving piece of information. Whispers and legends swirled around these figures. It was said they were part of secret brotherhoods, vast unseen networks of guides that stretched from the Atlas Mountains in Morocco all the way to the shores of Lake Chad. These brotherhoods were the invisible sinews holding the desert world together. They met infrequently, perhaps in a hidden oasis under the cover of a new moon. But when they did, the information they shared was more valuable than any gold. It was intelligence that could make or break entire empires. They would know which wells had run dry, a piece of information that could mean the difference between life and death for a caravan. They knew which tribes were restless, preparing for raids, allowing merchants to reroute and avoid conflict. They even knew which routes were considered haunted, places plagued by jinn or deadly fevers, where only the foolish or the desperate would dare to tread. This was the true currency of the desert. Knowledge. To betray such secrets was the ultimate transgression. The punishment was not a simple fine or a brief imprisonment. It was exile, a fate often worse than death in a world where community meant survival. Or, as some legends whispered, it was something far more terrifying: the sand trials. In these trials, a traitor would be tied to a post and left alone in the heart of the dunes, for the desert itself to pass judgment. The scorching sun, the freezing nights, the relentless thirst, few, if any, ever returned. This strict code of conduct and secrecy wasn't just about self-preservation. It was about maintaining a delicate balance. These brotherhoods ensured stability across a vast and often chaotic region. Even rival tribes, constantly at war over territory or resources, respected the guide's code. It was an unwritten law, higher than any tribal allegiance. It was said that during times of war, guides from opposing sides could meet at night among the silent dunes. There they would exchange safe passage agreements, ensuring that even in conflict, the vital arteries of trade would not be severed, because everyone understood a fundamental truth: the desert came before politics. Without the guides, trade would die, and without trade, entire kingdoms would starve. In a very real sense, these men were the unseen governors of the Sahara. A merchant might own a fortune in gold, and a ruler might command an army, but the guides owned something far more fundamental. They owned direction. They held the keys to the desert. With a single decision, they could open or close the routes of commerce, the very lifeblood of North Africa. When the great Mansa Musa, the Sultan of Mali, embarked on his legendary pilgrimage to Mecca, his caravan laden with incredible wealth, it was the Berber guides who made that journey possible, navigating him safely across thousands of miles of treacherous terrain. When the vital salt mines of Tagaza were raided, disrupting a trade that was as valuable as gold, it was the alliances and negotiations of the guides that restored balance and allowed the salt to flow once more. And when plagues swept across the Sahel, threatening to devastate entire cities, it was the guides who masterfully redirected trade routes, keeping communities connected and supplied, effectively saving them from starvation and collapse. Their silence was never a sign of ignorance or passivity. It was control. It was the quiet confidence of someone who understands the world they inhabit better than anyone else. And when one of these masters of the sand finally reached the end of his journey, his burial was a ritual as sacred as any royal funeral. But you wouldn't find their tombs in the bustling cities or grand necropolises. They were returned to the very element they had conquered, the desert itself. They were buried in the dunes, their bodies gently covered by the shifting sands at dawn, becoming one with the landscape they knew so intimately. With them, they took their most precious tools, their compass stones. These weren't elaborate navigational instruments, but often small, simple stones, worn smooth from decades of use, held in the palm to feel the direction of the wind or used to read the stars. These stones were their connection to the world, and it was forbidden for anyone to remove them from a guide's final resting place. Even today, travelers might stumble upon these forgotten graves, marked only by a simple ring of stones, a subtle sign that the sand once swallowed a legend. The Berber people believe that these places hold a special power. They say that if you camp near such a site and light a fire, the wind will mysteriously shift its course, moving around your camp instead of through it, a final act of guidance. A sign of respect from the elements, honoring the one who once commanded them. Even in death, they were still guides. Their legacy lives on, not in written histories or grand monuments, but in the oral traditions of the desert peoples. In the oldest songs of the Tuareg, you can still hear their memory echo. Low, rhythmic chants that tell stories of men who could cross 1,000 dunes and never lose their way, who could read the stars like a book and the wind like a language. It is said that even now, when a sandstorm rises suddenly from the horizon, blotting out the sun and turning the world into a maelstrom of dust, it is the spirit of a guide walking again, leading an invisible caravan safely through the chaos. They are a powerful reminder that true influence is unto always about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about knowledge, trust, and a deep, silent understanding of your world. Their story is a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest power is the one that is felt, not seen. Centuries have passed. The great caravans are fewer now. Where camels once grumbled under heavy loads, the hum of engines now fills the air. Roads of black tar cut through the silence of ancient routes, lines drawn on an unlined page. Yet the desert remains. It is vast, unmoved, sacred, and the descendants of those legendary Berber guides, the Tuareg and the Amazigh, walk its sands. Some drive trucks laden with salt and dates, their tires tracing paths their ancestors walked. Others ride motorbikes for tourists, their veils whipping in the wind, a modern echo of an ancient silhouette. But deep inside, they carry the same rhythm, the same profound humility before the sand. Ask them where they learned to navigate this endless expanse, and they'll gesture toward the horizon and say, from there, they mean from the same timeless teachers, the stars, the wind, and the earth itself. Modern technology has tried to replace the mind of the guide. Satellites map the routes from space. GPS devices mark coordinates with cold precision. And yet, every year, travelers still get lost. Every year, the Sahara offers a stark reminder to humanity that it is not a landscape to be conquered, but a presence to be respected. It's a powerful, living entity. Even with all our sophisticated machines, our advanced algorithms, our digital certainty, the desert still decides who returns. The old guides, if they were here, would surely smile at that. They would say, you cannot navigate the desert by machines, you must navigate it by heart. The heart understands what the machine cannot. the feel of the air, the texture of the sand, the whisper of the wind that carries a warning or a promise. It's a language learned over millennia, passed down not in books, but in blood and memory. In recent decades, anthropologists and historians have sought out the last of these oral navigators. They are elders, their faces etched with the lines of sun and time, who still remember the names of dunes and wells that no map has ever recorded. These are places that exist only in memory, passed from one generation to the next. For them, memory is geography. The stories they tell are not just tales. They are maps, charts of survival. They speak of silence not as an absence of sound, but as a tool for survival, a way to listen to the desert's subtle language. They remind us of a profound truth. Maps fade, ink bleeds, paper turns to dust, but stories endure, because the desert, much like time itself, is not a force to be defeated. It can only be understood. Among the Tuareg, the famed blue-rubbed nomads of the Central Sahara, there is a proverb that captures this relationship perfectly. They say, "The desert remembers its masters." This isn't a statement of pride or dominance. It's one of deep reverence. It means the desert acknowledges those who have shown it respect, those who have learned its ways and moved in harmony with its rhythms. When the wind sweeps across the dunes, they believe it carries the breath of those ancient guides, their wisdom whispering through the grains of sand. When a storm passes and a profound stillness settles over the land, they say, "The kings of sand have spoken." It's a recognition that they are part of something far older and greater than themselves. Today, modern guides still follow these invisible lines across the Sahara. When asked how they know the way, they often struggle to explain it in logical terms. They speak of a feeling, a pulse in the earth, a subtle shift in the air that tells them when to turn, when to stop for the night, when to seek shelter. It's not something that can be measured by any scientific instrument. It is instinct, heritage, and spirit, woven together into an unbreakable thread of knowledge. One Tuareg elder, when speaking to a researcher, put it beautifully. He said, "My son uses a phone to cross the desert. I use silence. The phone's battery dies. Silence never dies." In that simple statement lies the truest legacy of the Berber guides. Technology is a useful tool, but it is finite and fragile. The inner wisdom, the connection to the natural world that is infinite. The story of the Berber guide is not just about finding direction from point A to point B, it's a deeper lesson about balance. It's about the delicate dance between control and surrender, between cold, hard precision and unwavering faith. It teaches us that true mastery doesn't come from applying force or imposing one's will upon the world. It comes from listening, from observing, from understanding the subtle cues of the environment and adapting to them. In a world obsessed with speed, with getting everything done faster, these guides moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if time itself bowed to their steady pace. They were living proof that greatness is not always loud and flashy. More often, it is steady, patient, and unseen, like a lone figure moving with purpose across a vast, empty horizon that others would fear to even approach. And as night falls over the Sahara, the same stars that guided them for millennia begin to shimmer in the ink-black sky. Canopus, Sirius, Polaris, their ancient light falls on dunes that have shifted and reformed over centuries. Dunes that once held the footprints of these legends. The great caravans may be gone. The empires they supplied may have dissolved into the dust of history. And the names of the wealthy traders may be long forgotten. But the desert still remembers. Because memory, in this sacred land, is not written on paper or carved in stone. It is written on the wind, etched in the sand, and reflected in the eternal light of the stars, the night deepens. The last caravan fires fade into embers. The dunes whisper, as if exhaling after a long, slow breath. And so, our story of the Berber guides, the kings of silence, the masters of direction draws to its gentle end. Let's rest here under the patient watch of the stars. The desert, that endless cathedral of sand, still holds the memory of footsteps that vanished 1,000 years ago. And perhaps that's the truest kind of immortality, the kind that doesn't speak, doesn't shout, but simply remains. They called the Sahara *Alisp Ra al-Kubrab, the Great Desert. But to the Berber, it was never empty. It was alive, breathing, listening. Every grain of sand held a story. Every ripple was a reminder that the earth itself remembers movement. And for those who crossed it, those who carried salt, gold, and whispers, their task was more than survival, it was communion. They did not walk across the desert, they spoke to it. They read its moods, its silences, its shifting tempers. They knew when the wind carried a warning. They knew when the stars leaned a little lower in the sky, pointing the way home. Let's pause here for a moment. The fire crackles softly, and we rest beneath the stars. The Berber guide's life was one of constant negotiation with nature, with man, with fate itself. By day, he faced a heat that shimmered like madness. By night, he followed constellations that only the initiated could name. His heart beat between danger and duty, between hunger and the promise of arrival. Yet somehow, amid all this, he found meaning not in wealth, but in knowing the way. There is a quiet nobility in that. To walk paths unseen, to remember routes that no map dares to show, to lead others through a world that does not forgive mistakes. That is the kind of wisdom the world has forgotten, the wisdom of those who move slowly, who listen deeply, who travel without leaving scars. We often imagine heroes as men who fight, conquer, or rule, but sometimes the greatest hero is the one who simply endures. The Berber guide did not need monuments. His temple was the desert itself. His prayers were the steps of his camel. His scripture was written in the alignment of stars. Every journey began with a small silence, the moment before the first hoof touched the sand, and every journey ended with gratitire, silent bow toward the horizon, as if saying, "Thank you for letting me pass." Perhaps that is the quiet lesson the desert offers to all of us, that greatness isn't loud, that truth doesn't rush, that even in a world of storms, the calmest traveler often goes the farthest. Let's pause here for a moment. A faint wind stirs the sand. The night grows cooler. You can almost hear the desert hum, deep and low, like a lullaby for the weary. Long after the caravans ceased, after the routes faded and the cities turned to dust, the stories of the guides still moved past in whispers by Tuareg elders, sung by travelers resting near old wells. They spoke of men who vanished into storms and never returned, but whose names were carried by the wind. They said the desert took them not as a punishment, but as a kind of adoption, because those who truly understood her, who respected her silence, who read her signs, became part of her forever. In this way, the Sahara was both grave and guardian, and the Berbers its chosen interpreters. Somewhere tonight, a descendant of those guides sits beside a small fire. Maybe his tools have changed his compass now, a satellite screen. His camel replaced by a motorbike, but the desert remains the same teacher. Still vast, still unbending, still alive. And if you asked him what the desert sounds like, he might say it sounds like memory breathing. He might tell you that the sand doesn't just cover, it keeps. It keeps the stories, the songs, the unspoken prayers of those who dared to cross it. Let's pause here one last time. The sky stretches endlessly above. The constellations shimmer like old companions. You feel the weight of history settle softly around you, gentle, warm like a woven blanket. And now, as you drift toward sleep, remember this. Every person carries a desert within them, an expanse of silence and trial where they must learn to find their own stars, their own routes, their own way home. Sometimes the sand blinds you, sometimes the wind tests you. But if you move gently, if you listen carefully, you will find that your heart, like the Berber's compass, always knows where north lies. So breathe deeply. Let the wind guide your thoughts toward stillness. Let the sand cradle your spirit like the dunes cradle the night. The journey is over now. The fire burns low, and in the hush that follows, even the desert seems to dream. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If these stories stir something within you, consider subscribing and joining our community. Until we meet again, may you find your way under these starlit skies. You are under Baobab skies.